who killed Tayná Adriane da Silva, a nightmare that lasts 11 years. In the quiet streets of Goiânia, Brazil, there are some names that should never be forgotten, some stories that demand to be told, some injustices that cry out for resolution. The name Tayná Adriane da Silva belongs to all three categories. For 11 years, her family has lived in a nightmare that began on a warm evening in 2013 and continues to this day, a labyrinth of unanswered questions, failed investigations, and a justice system that seems to have forgotten a young woman whose life was brutally cut short. Tayná was 23 years old when she disappeared. She was a nursing student, a daughter, a sister, a friend to many. She had dreams of helping people, of making a difference in the world through medicine and compassion. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who stayed late to help classmates with difficult subjects, who called her mother every day just to say she loved her. On the night of March 15, 2013, Tayná left her apartment to meet someone she trusted. She never returned home. What happened in the hours that followed would become one of the most disturbing and perplexing murder cases in Goiás state history, a crime so brutal and senseless that it would haunt everyone who encountered it. But this isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about the failure of justice, about a family's relentless pursuit of truth, about corruption and incompetence that allowed a killer to walk free. It's about how a single act of violence can destroy not just one life, but dozens of lives, rippling outward like poison in water. For 11 years, Tayná's mother, Conceição Silva, has fought for answers. She has knocked on every door, spoken to every official, followed every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. She has transformed from a grieving mother into a relentless investigator, driven by love and sustained by an unshakable belief that somewhere, someone knows what happened to her daughter. The case file is thick with contradictions, false leads, and evidence that seems to point in multiple directions. There are suspects who had motives, witnesses who changed their stories, and physical evidence that was either mishandled or mysteriously disappeared. There are theories about jealous lovers, drug connections, and even darker possibilities that investigators have been reluctant to pursue. But at the center of it all is a simple question that has tormented a family for over a decade. Who killed Tayná Adriane da Silva? And perhaps more importantly, why has no one been held accountable for her death? If you think you know how deep corruption can run, how far a cover-up can reach, you're about to discover that some truths are buried so deep that it takes 11 years just to begin digging them up. The last day. March 15th, 2013, started like any other day in Tayná's life. She woke up in her small apartment near the university, made coffee, and spent the morning reviewing notes for an upcoming exam in pediatric nursing. Her roommate, Juliana, remembered her being in good spirits, excited about a clinical rotation she was starting the following week at the Children's Hospital. Around noon, she received a phone call that seemed to change her mood. Juliana noticed that Tayná's voice became quieter, more serious. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, and when it ended, Tayná seemed troubled. "Everything okay?" Juliana asked. "Yeah, just someone wants to meet me tonight." "Someone from my past," Tayná replied, but she didn't elaborate. The afternoon passed normally. Tayná attended her classes, had lunch with friends, and spent time in the library working on a research project. Several classmates would later tell investigators that she seemed distracted, checking her phone more frequently than usual. At 6 p.m., she returned to her apartment and began getting ready to go out. She showered, did her hair, and put on a blue dress that her mother had bought her for Christmas. She applied makeup carefully, as if the meeting she was going to was important to her. At 7:30 p.m., Tayná received a text message. Juliana saw her read it and nod, as if confirming something. "I have to go. Tayná said, grabbing her purse and keys. "I'll probably be back late, so don't wait up." "Be careful," Juliana called after her, a warning that would haunt her for years to come. Tayná left the apartment building at 7:45 p.m. The security camera in the lobby captured her walking out, looking back once as if she was having second thoughts. It would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Her phone records show that she made one call at 8:15 p.m., a brief conversation lasting less than 2 minutes. The number belonged to someone she had known for years, someone she trusted completely, someone who, according to their own statement to police, never saw her that night. At 8:30 p.m., Tayná's phone went dark. No more calls, no more text messages, no more GPS signals. It was as if she had simply vanished from the face of the earth. When she didn't return home by morning, Juliana initially wasn't worried. But when she missed her morning classes without calling, Juliana knew something was wrong. Tayná was obsessively punctual, especially when it came to her studies. By noon on March 16th, Juliana was calling Tayná's mother, Conceição. By evening, they were at the police station filing a missing person report. The officer who took their statement seemed more interested in suggesting that Tayná had probably run off with a boyfriend than in taking their concerns seriously. 3 days later, on March 19th, a jogger found Tayná's body in a wooded area on the outskirts of Goiânia. She had been murdered, but the crime scene was so disturbing that details were initially withheld from the family and the public. The discovery. The wooded area where Tayná's body was found was a popular spot for joggers and dog walkers, a place where families came for picnics on weekends. It was the last place anyone would expect to find evidence of such a brutal crime. The location was approximately 15 kilometers from where Tayná was last seen, in an area she had no known connection to. Carlos Mendoza, the jogger who made the discovery, would later tell investigators that he almost didn't stop. He had seen what looked like discarded clothing from the trail, and his first instinct was to keep running. But something made him look closer, and when he realized what he was seeing, he immediately called the police. The crime scene that greeted investigators was unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. Tayná's body showed signs of extreme violence, suggesting that her death had not been quick or merciful. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been tortured before being killed, with evidence of sexual assault and prolonged suffering. But it was the staging of the crime scene that most disturbed investigators. Tayná's body had been positioned in a specific way, with personal items arranged around her in a pattern that suggested ritual or symbolic meaning. Her killer hadn't just murdered her. They had turned her death into some kind of twisted performance. Detective Roberto Almeida, the lead investigator assigned to the case, had 20 years of experience in homicide investigations. He had seen every kind of violence humans could inflict on each other, but the Tayná Silva crime scene affected him in ways he struggled to articulate. It wasn't just the brutality, he would later explain, it was the deliberateness of it. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was someone who had planned this, who had thought about every detail, and that made it infinitely more disturbing. The forensic team spent 2 days processing the scene, collecting evidence that should have been enough to identify the killer. They found DNA evidence, fingerprints, fibers from clothing, and other physical evidence that pointed to specific individuals. But from the very beginning, there were problems with the investigation. Evidence was mislabeled, chain of custody was broken, and crucial samples were contaminated or lost. What should have been a straightforward forensic investigation became a comedy of errors that would plague the case for years to come. The autopsy revealed the full extent of Tayná's suffering. She had been held captive for several hours before her death, during which time she had been systematically tortured. The medical examiner found evidence of restraints, burns, and other injuries that painted a picture of prolonged agony. Most disturbing of all was the evidence that Tayná had been conscious for most of her ordeal. She had fought for her life, had tried to escape, had endured hours of terror before finally succumbing to her injuries. The knowledge of her suffering would haunt her family and drive their relentless pursuit of justice. The investigation begins. The initial investigation into Tayná's murder was assigned to Detective Roberto Almeida, a veteran investigator with an impressive solve rate and a reputation for thoroughness. But from the moment he began examining the evidence, Almeida sensed that this case would be different from anything he had handled before. The first red flag came when he tried to access Tayná's phone records. The telecommunications company claimed that the records had been accidentally deleted due to a system error. When Almeida pressed for backup records, he was told that those had been corrupted as well. In 20 years of police work, he had never encountered such a convenient technical failure. The second red flag came when he attempted to interview key witnesses. Several people who had been in contact with Tayná in the days before her death suddenly became unavailable. Some left town unexpectedly. Others hired lawyers and refused to speak without immunity agreements. And one simply disappeared entirely. Most troubling of all was the behavior of his own department. Evidence that should have been processed immediately sat in storage for weeks. Lab results that should have taken days took months to complete. And when Almeida requested additional resources for the investigation, he was told that budget constraints made it impossible. Despite the obstacles, Almeida began to piece together a picture of Tayná's final days. He discovered that she had been receiving threatening phone calls in the weeks before her death, calls that she had mentioned to friends but hadn't reported to police. The calls had been brief and cryptic, but they had clearly frightened her. He also learned that Tayná had been involved in a relationship that had ended badly several months before her death. The man, whose name was initially withheld from the media, was described by friends as controlling and possessive. When Tayná had tried to end the relationship, he had become increasingly aggressive and threatening. But when Almeida tried to interview this ex-boyfriend, he discovered that the man had an alibi that seemed unshakable. He had been at a business conference in São Paulo on the night of Tayná's murder, with dozens of witnesses and hotel records to confirm his presence. The alibi was so solid that it seemed almost too good to be true. As Almeida dug deeper, he began to uncover connections that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The ex-boyfriend wasn't just any ordinary citizen. He was the son of a prominent local politician. His family had connections throughout the state government, including relationships with high-ranking police officials. When Almeida attempted to investigate these connections, he was called into his supervisor's office and told to focus on the evidence, not on conspiracy theories. The message was clear. Some avenues of investigation were off-limits. 6 months into the investigation, Almeida was suddenly transferred to a different department. His replacement was a detective with no experience in homicide investigations and no apparent interest in pursuing the leads that Almeida had developed. The Tayná Silva case was effectively shelved, filed away with dozens of other unsolved murders. The family's quest. When the police investigation stalled, Conceição Silva made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would find her daughter's killer herself. She had no training in criminal investigation, no connections in law enforcement, and no resources beyond her own determination and a mother's love. But she had something that the official investigators seemed to lack, an unshakable commitment to the truth. Conceição began by retracing every step of the police investigation. She obtained copies of all the reports, interviewed witnesses who had been ignored or dismissed, and followed up on leads that had been abandoned. What she discovered was a pattern of incompetence and obstruction that went far beyond simple bureaucratic failure. Evidence had been lost or destroyed. Witnesses had been intimidated into silence. Crucial forensic tests had never been performed. It was as if someone had systematically dismantled the investigation from the inside, ensuring that no meaningful progress could be made. But Conceição also discovered something else. Her daughter had been living a more complicated life than anyone had realized. Tayná had been involved in activities and relationships that she had kept secret from her family, connections that might have led to her death. Through patient detective work, Conceição learned that Tayná had been working part-time at a private clinic that catered to wealthy clients. The clinic provided services that weren't always strictly legal, including procedures that wealthy women wanted to keep private. Tayná's job had been to assist with these procedures and, more importantly, to ensure that client confidentiality was maintained. The clinic was owned by Dr. Eduardo Vargas, a prominent physician with connections throughout Goiás society. His clients included politicians' wives, judges' daughters, and the mistresses of powerful businessmen. The clinic's records were a treasure trove of secrets that could destroy careers and marriages. Conceição discovered that in the weeks before her death, Tayná had become increasingly uncomfortable with what she was seeing at the clinic. She had confided to a friend that she was considering reporting certain activities to the medical board, activities that involved not just illegal procedures, but also drug trafficking and money laundering. The friend, who spoke to Conceição only after being promised anonymity, revealed that Tayná had been keeping detailed records of what she witnessed at the clinic. She had been documenting procedures, photographing evidence, and building a case that could have brought down not just Dr. Vargas, but an entire network of corruption. But when Conceição tried to find these records, she discovered that Tayná's apartment had been searched shortly after her death. The search had been conducted by police, ostensibly looking for evidence related to her murder. But according to Juliana, her roommate, the officers had seemed more interested in removing things than in finding clues. Conceição realized that her daughter had been killed not by a random predator or jealous lover, but by someone who wanted to silence her permanently. Tayná had stumbled onto something that powerful people were willing to kill to protect, and she had paid the ultimate price for her conscience. The suspects. As Conceição delved deeper into her daughter's secret life, a picture began to emerge of the people who might have wanted Tayná dead. The list of suspects was longer and more disturbing than anyone had initially realized, involving individuals with the power and connections to orchestrate both a murder and its cover-up. At the top of the list was Dr. Eduardo Vargas, the owner of the clinic where Tayná had worked. Vargas was a man with everything to lose if his illegal activities were exposed. His clinic generated millions of reais in revenue, much of it from procedures that existed in legal grey areas. More importantly, his client list read like a who's who of Goiás society. Conceição learned that Vargas had a history of dealing harshly with employees who threatened his operations. A former nurse had died in a car accident after threatening to report the clinic's activities. A receptionist who had tried to blackmail clients had simply disappeared. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it, but Vargas was careful to keep his hands clean. He employed others to handle the dirty work, including a man named Paulo Henrique Santos, who served as the clinic's security consultant. Santos had a background in military special operations and a reputation for solving problems permanently. Santos had been in Goiânia on the night of Tayná's murder, despite having no official business in the city. His alibi was provided by associates who had every reason to lie for him, and his methods matched the brutality of Tayná's death, suggesting someone with training in interrogation and torture. But the most shocking suspect was someone much closer to home, Tayná's ex-boyfriend, Ricardo Mendes, the politician's son whose alibi had seemed so unshakable. Conceição's investigation revealed that the alibi was fabricated, constructed through a network of lies and false documents. Ricardo hadn't been in São Paulo on the night of the murder. He had been in Goiânia, and phone records that the police had claimed were destroyed actually showed him in contact with Tayná on the night she died. The records had been hidden, not destroyed, buried in a bureaucratic maze that required months of legal battles to access. More disturbing still was the discovery that Ricardo had known about Tayná's work at the clinic and her plans to expose its activities. He had been using their relationship to gather information about what she knew, information that he had passed along to people who had every reason to want her silenced. The investigation revealed a conspiracy that involved not just individual criminals, but entire institutions. Police officers had been paid to lose evidence. Prosecutors had been pressured to avoid certain lines of inquiry. Judges had been influenced to dismiss cases before they could go to trial. The breakthrough. 7 years after Tayná's murder, Conceição's investigation finally achieved a breakthrough that would change everything. It came from an unexpected source, a dying man's confession that would expose the full extent of the conspiracy and provide the evidence needed to bring the killers to justice. Paulo Henrique Santos, the security consultant who had worked for Dr. Vargas, was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2020. Facing his own mortality and haunted by years of guilt, he reached out to a priest who had been counseling him. In what he believed would be a confidential confession, Santos revealed his role in multiple murders, including Tayná's. The priest, Father Miguel Rodrigues, was bound by the seal of confession and couldn't reveal what Santos had told him. But Santos, perhaps seeking some form of redemption, agreed to make a formal statement to authorities. He contacted a federal prosecutor who was known for his integrity and his willingness to take on corruption cases. Santos's confession was devastating in its detail and scope. He admitted to killing Tayná on the orders of Dr. Vargas, who had been acting on behalf of powerful clients who feared exposure. He described how the murder had been planned and executed, how the crime scene had been staged to mislead investigators, and how evidence had been systematically destroyed or hidden. But Santos revealed much more than just the details of Tayná's murder. He provided a comprehensive account of the criminal network that had operated in Goiás for over a decade. He named names, described operations, and provided evidence that implicated dozens of powerful individuals in crimes ranging from murder to money laundering. According to Santos, Tayná hadn't been the first person killed to protect the network's secrets. There had been at least 6 other murders over the years, all made to look like accidents, suicides, or random crimes. The victims had been journalists, whistleblowers, and former employees who had threatened to expose the truth. Most importantly, Santos provided physical evidence to support his claims. He had kept records, photographs, and recordings as insurance against his employers. Hidden in a safety deposit box were documents that proved the existence of the criminal network and the involvement of specific individuals in Tayná's murder. The federal prosecutor, Dr. Amanda Carvalho, recognized the significance of Santos's confession and the evidence he provided. She immediately began building a case that would target not just the individual killers, but the entire network of corruption that had protected them. Working in secret, Dr. Carvalho began to build an airtight case. She gathered additional evidence, interviewed witnesses under federal protection, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies that were outside the influence of the local corruption network. On March 15, 2022, exactly 9 years after Tayná's murder, federal agents launched Operation Justice, a coordinated series of arrests that would finally bring her killers to justice. The operation involved over 200 federal agents and resulted in the arrest of 47 individuals, including Dr. Eduardo Vargas, Ricardo Mendes, and several high-ranking police and government officials. The trial. The trial of the individuals accused in Tayná's murder and the broader corruption conspiracy began in March 2023, 10 years after her death. The proceedings were held in a federal courthouse in Brasilia, moved from Goiás due to concerns about local corruption and the safety of witnesses and court officials. The prosecution, led by Dr. Amanda Carvalho, faced the enormous challenge of proving a conspiracy that had operated for over a decade and involved dozens of powerful individuals. The defense teams, representing some of the most influential people in Brazilian society, were determined to discredit the evidence and paint the prosecution as a politically motivated witch hunt. The star witness was Paulo Henrique Santos, whose confession had provided the foundation for the entire case. Despite his terminal cancer, Santos testified for 3 days, providing detailed accounts of the murders he had committed and the network of corruption that had protected him. Santos's testimony was devastating in its specificity. He described how he had been contacted by Dr. Vargas and instructed to handle the Tayná problem permanently. He detailed the planning that had gone into the murder, including surveillance of Tayná's movements and the selection of the remote location where her body was found. Most damaging of all, Santos played recordings he had made of conversations with his employers. The recordings captured Dr. Vargas and others discussing Tayná's murder in chilling detail, treating her death as nothing more than a business problem that needed to be solved. The defense teams attacked Santos's credibility, arguing that he was a dying man seeking to reduce his own culpability by implicating others. They suggested that his confession was fabricated or exaggerated, motivated by a desire for revenge against former associates. But the prosecution had more than just Santos's testimony. They presented physical evidence that corroborated his account, including documents, photographs, and financial records that proved the existence of the criminal network. They showed how money had flowed between the various participants, how communications had been coordinated, and how the cover-up had been orchestrated. Perhaps the most emotional testimony came from Conceição Silva, Tayná's mother, who described her 10-year fight for justice. She spoke about the obstacles she had encountered, the threats she had received, and the determination that had sustained her through years of frustration and disappointment. "My daughter was murdered twice," Conceição testified, "first by the people who killed her and then by the system that covered up her murder. But she will not be forgotten, and her killers will not escape justice." After 6 months of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned verdicts that would finally bring justice for Tayná and the other victims of this criminal conspiracy. The verdict. On September 15, 2023, after 6 months of testimony and 3 weeks of deliberation, the federal jury delivered verdicts that would finally bring justice for Tayná Adriane da Silva and expose one of the most extensive corruption networks in Brazilian history. Paulo Henrique Santos, who had confessed to personally murdering Tayná, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite his cooperation with authorities, the brutality of his crimes and his role in multiple murders made him ineligible for any reduction in sentence. Dr. Eduardo Vargas, the mastermind behind the criminal network, was convicted on charges including conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, money laundering, and operating a criminal enterprise. He was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over 50 million reais to the families of his victims. Ricardo Mendes, Tayná's ex-boyfriend and the politician's son, was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. His role in providing information about Tayná's activities and helping to plan her murder earned him a sentence of 25 years in prison. The convictions extended far beyond the immediate perpetrators of Tayná's murder. 12 police officers, including 2 high-ranking commanders, were convicted of corruption and obstruction of justice. 6 prosecutors and 3 judges were found guilty of accepting bribes and perverting the course of justice. Judge Helena Santos, who presided over the trial, delivered a scathing assessment of the corruption that had allowed these crimes to continue for so long. "This case represents a complete failure of our institutions," she said during sentencing, "when those sworn to protect and serve instead choose to corrupt and destroy. The very foundations of our democracy are threatened." For Conceição, the verdicts represented the end of a 10-year nightmare, but also the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She had achieved what many thought impossible, bringing powerful criminals to justice and exposing a system of corruption that had seemed untouchable. "Tayná can finally rest in peace," Conceição said after the verdicts were announced. "But this is not just about my daughter. This is about all the victims who were silenced, all the families who were denied justice, all the people who suffered because these criminals thought they were above the law." Reflective conclusion. The murder of Tayná Adriane da Silva was a crime that should have been solved within weeks, not years. A young woman with no enemies, no dangerous associations, and no involvement in criminal activities should not have become the victim of such brutal violence. But her death exposed something far more sinister than a single act of murder. It revealed a system of corruption so extensive and entrenched that it had become a cancer on the very institutions meant to protect society. For 11 years, Tayná's family lived in a nightmare of unanswered questions and denied justice. They watched as evidence disappeared, witnesses were silenced, and investigations were sabotaged by the very people sworn to uphold the law. They experienced firsthand how corruption can transform a justice system into an instrument of oppression, protecting the guilty while tormenting the innocent. But they also proved that even the most powerful criminal networks are not invincible when confronted by the determination of those who refuse to give up. Conceição Silva's relentless pursuit of truth, sustained by a mother's love and an unshakable belief in justice, ultimately brought down a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for over a decade. The case serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. It warns us of how easily corruption can infect our institutions, how quickly the protectors can become the predators, how thoroughly justice can be perverted when good people remain silent. But it also shows us that truth has a power that cannot be permanently suppressed, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Tayná's story is ultimately about more than murder and corruption. It's about the eternal struggle between good and evil, between truth and lies, between justice and injustice. It reminds us that this struggle is never finally won, that each generation must fight anew to preserve the values that make civilization possible. The young woman who dreamed of healing others through medicine became, in death, a healer of society itself. Her murder exposed wounds that had been festering in darkness, allowing them to be treated and healed. Her memory inspired reforms that will protect future generations from similar tragedies. In the end, Tayná Adriane da Silva achieved something that her killers never intended. She became immortal. Not in the way that criminals achieve notoriety, but in the way that heroes achieve lasting impact. Her name will be remembered not for how she died, but for how her death changed the world for the better. The nightmare that lasted 11 years is finally over, but the dream of justice that Tayná's case inspired will continue forever. In courtrooms and police stations, in government offices and newsrooms, in the hearts and minds of all who believe in justice, her legacy lives on. And perhaps that is the most fitting tribute to a young woman whose life was cut short, but whose impact will be felt for generations to come. Tayná Adriane da Silva is gone, but the change she brought to the world ensures that she will never be forgotten. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel to learn about other cases where ordinary people fought extraordinary battles for justice and the lasting changes they achieved.